All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm really excited for my guest today. My guest is Hilary Cooperman, who is a scholar, artist, and activist. She received her PhD in performance studies from Northwestern University, and she's currently a qualitative researcher and strategist at Publicis Sapient. I hope I got that right. So welcome, Hilary. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's begin with a general question about how you came to UX research, user experience research.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually consider myself to be one of the very first UX researchers. I started doing research for digital products back in the very late 90s. I was working for a company that did brand consulting and ended up working with a company that was creating a test preparation product. And so I ended up doing project management for that project. And then the company started creating its own digital products. And at that time, it was a very small company. So I rose through the ranks very quickly and ended up managing the process of creating, it was a video editing platform that we were working on. And we were just, trying to figure out how to do this kind of work. We had employed an engineer, we had employed some developers, all on contract to try to figure out how to create a process by which we could create a digital product. So that took me from the brand strategy role to wearing many different hats. And I really enjoyed that work. And from that brand strategy company, then I ended up at Fallon in Minneapolis. And they were just beginning to also look at advertising online. So I was put in the role of an interactive brand strategist, I think is what it was called. And I was looking at the web experience of various brands and making sure that the brand experience was communicated through the web offering. I should also say, my background before this was in acting and performance. I had gone to school for that in my undergrad. But during that time, I did a lot of ethnography. And working with different communities. I did a community project in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, and I was really looking at Latin rights, immigration rights in that community, and working very closely with an organization there. And then within the discipline of performance studies, performing that research. So I was very lucky to work under a great mentor, Dwight Conquergood, at that time, and he taught a class in performance ethnography. So that's where my roots in ethnography started, and that really helped me as I started doing brand strategy, and then later working in advertising agencies. I was doing a lot of qualitative research. And then, to make a long story short, after doing a lot of work in that space, for a lot of products, I started sort of questioning the meaning of some of the work I was doing and wanting some kind of, I guess, to put those skills to use for something that was more meaningful to me. And so I decided to go and do a master's degree, and I ended up doing it in Middle East studies and traveling to Israel and doing that work at Ben Gurion University in Israel, which was an incredible experience. And then from there, did my PhD in performance studies, which is kind of going back to what I had done, conducting ethnographic research and then performing it. And my dissertation research had to do with looking at Palestinians' experience of occupation in the West Bank. So that's where I did my dissertation research. And from there, I ended up doing an assistant professorship at Rollins College in Florida. And that's where I've been the past 7 years, teaching courses in ethnographic performance, and also kind of classes as they related to Middle East studies and performance. So Rap and Revolution of the Middle East, storytelling. I taught a class called Refugees of the Middle East Performance Lab. So we looked at Syrian refugee experiences and then performed, aspects of those experiences for an audience. So that's the work that I was doing. And I know I'm coming back, and that's a very long introduction, but so out of that, a lot of things changed for me during that time. There are a lot of kind of structural problems for me within academia, and I wasn't able to do much research during that time. I was primarily teaching, and there was a lot of work that I was doing into the night hours in a theater department, and the lifestyle just wasn't it wasn't quite the right fit for me. And that's when I started thinking about going into industry. And a good friend of mine, kind of from back in the days of that brand consulting company, suggested UX research to me. And that's when I really started looking into it, going, oh, this is something, I feel like I could bring some of those other experiences together, and that UX research would be something that I could still, I would always be doing research, and I feel like I could add something to the field as well.
Wow. Wow. What an impressive path. And it is so rich. So initially you were working on these organizational goals before getting into an academic setting. And because people who begin in an academic setting discussing research, learning about research, they treat it initially, at least initially, in an abstract way, like learning about statistics, and then filling these placeholders with material from the world. Like, oh, I'm learning to do ethnography. Now, what should I study? But it seems like you were really tight. You had this connection to real life issues in almost every step of your path. So, what the methods that you were learning were in dialogue with life material and life problems and social problems.
That's a really good observation. I hadn't really thought of it myself that way, but I've never, I guess, I've never thought I want to be that, and it was a position or a role, or I need to be a professor. I mean, I always needed to go to experiences to understand or discover something I had more questions about or wanted to seek answers for. And so performance, ethnography, those were ways that I could think and reflect on my own life experience, but also the experiences of those around me, and try to understand other people better and myself better through those processes, and hopefully communicate that to other people too, in a way that might affect them or change the way they might think and their belief systems, if they hadn't done that research themselves. So I always saw that as kind of a role that brought people together, while also kind of rediscovering or being able to work through things for myself, questions that I had and wanted to understand. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So one of my aims and hopes for this interview is to give an idea about both the general space of UX research and the particular space that you're positioned. So how would you describe the distinct position and your distinct engagement? What are some of the things that you do as a UX researcher that some other people are not doing, and vice versa?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Also, because I think I didn't know what to expect. I hadn't been a UX researcher for a number of years, and even then it was, in a nascent sort of form, and the context was very different. So I thought so much would have happened. It would be really hard to kind of figure everything out in this space. But I have to say, the projects and the technology have changed, but the role is very much the same. And what I find, at least in my role, that I'm very surprised about is the research part is important, but it's more that careful kind of diplomacy with clients and stakeholders, and strategizing and leading and disseminating sort of this research knowledge and why it's important. And all of that was very much kind of alive in the advertising brand space as well, trying to articulate why research needed to be done. But I think in a broad sense, people understand research needs to be done. It's the sense of, what is research, what makes good research. I think that is not well understood. And I find myself trying to, be diplomatic about revealing sort of uncovering for other people what makes good research, and why just any research won't get the kinds of insights that people are looking for that will move things forward in in an improved way. So that's a little bit about sort of, maybe not directly about my current role, but I find myself much more than I imagined, leading, planning, being strategic, and working to get the research that I envision done, more so than figuring out, which methodologies to use and making sure I recruit the right participants. And all of those things are important, but it's the management, it's the strategic thinking, it's the leadership that I find, is necessary in that role. And I didn't imagine that it would be so fundamentally part of this role.
Now, listening to you, what came to my mind was there's something that people say in psychoanalysis or psychotherapy in general, they say that it is not enough for a therapist or a psychoanalyst to have the right interpretation. It's not enough for the interpretation to be correct. It has to be delivered at the right time and in the right way. So there is this, because if it is not timed correctly, it might backfire. And what we are trying to deliver to the client or to a patient, but it applies not just in a therapeutic context. When we are, let's say, consulting with a CEO, our consultation has to be communicated at the right stage of how the company as a whole is making progress. If it is too early or too late, if it is not at a stage where it is meeting the timing of an action or a decision, then it might not do the thing that we are meant by it. So what I heard there from you was an awareness on the communicative aspect of what the research is trying to say, not just the research itself. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
absolutely. Yes. And I think that's where sort of my performance background also comes into play, because I'm thinking about audience all of the time. Who am I speaking with? If I'm speaking with a design team, I'm going to communicate the findings, but then I usually do kind of a preliminary meeting with the designers to find out what's possible. I don't want to go and make a bunch of recommendations to the client that the designers will say, we would never be able to do that. So there's the kind of preliminary meeting where we're brainstorming it. And I might also, I'm not a designer, I might not be able to articulate the recommendations in a way that makes sense in a design, as a designer. So it also reminds me a lot of the theater in a directorial role where the director is communicating the vision, but then the set designer, and the set, the crafts people create the set design. I might not have the language to tell them exactly what to build, but I tell them, what I found through research, I give them the insights, and then we work together to figure out what that product change or recommendation actually is. And then to the client, there's another layer then where I've gained their input so that I can express that user research in a way that's not just theoretical. These aren't just things that I found, but this is now how we can go and create an impact based on these insights. So there are a couple different levels, but you're absolutely right, in terms of what to communicate when, and to whom, I think is, really important. And people aren't always ready to hear things. There's a lot of, sometimes there are steps involved, meetings and processes, and, let's do a kickoff meeting where we gain, where we all kind of sit down and figure out what we know. Okay, now that we've done this kickoff meeting, I'll come back with a research plan. I may have been able to come back with a research, I may have come up with a research plan from the beginning. I may have been able to do that, but would I have had that buy-in? Would I have had that support from the team, which is really important if you're going to go ahead and get their permission to do all kinds of research, and also to make sure that they understand why it's important. So yeah, absolutely. Communication is a huge part of the role.
You talked about the dialogue or back and forth between idea, theory, and how things are implemented. Sometimes that is distributed over time. Sometimes it is done by different people, like the director and stage setting professionals. What are some of the other fundamental principles or assumptions that especially beginners in UX research or people who are interested in entering into it should be mindful of?
It's hard for me to put myself kind of back in the beginner's shoes, but something I've noticed in others I've worked with is there is it's difficult when you're starting out to be an expert, right? And at least in my role where I'm working, we're a consultancy. So we're expected to be experts, and to come in, even if you're at a junior level, you're expected to come in and have a sense of what user research is. So I think it's difficult to have that kind of confidence as a beginner. And I would say, you don't. I mean, it's expected of you, but I think the way that a researcher gains expertise is through listening. And I do think that you need to give yourself the space and time to learn and listen before you are advising, before you are, and hopefully there are some mentors at an organization where a beginner would begin to help in that process. I expected to have to start, I'm terrible with expressions. on the ground running, I think is the expression. And I forgot, in any sort of business, there's an onboarding process. So, there was someone there who was already doing research, and I just got to observe, I probably would have been able to observe longer, but I was so anxious to kind of jump in that I started working on the project with this person immediately. But I could have sat there, observed, watched, and listened probably for about 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would just say to a beginner, don't worry, you're not going to be expected to jump in and be working with clients day one. You'll have that opportunity to watch, to listen, and take advantage of that, before you are put in a position.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. Thank you. Another, maybe you already touched on this, but I want to directly ask you about any misunderstandings or misconceptions of the field that you might want to point out and clarify. Are there any you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, I think one of the misconceptions is that it's easy. I've seen a lot of things floating around, that
Sure.
it's a really easy field to get into. And I want to kind of I don't want to discourage people from entering the field, of course, but I do think it can look easy because you are speaking with people, you're writing up a report, you're not coding, you're not making the product, you don't have, this complicated code that you're writing. But there are other skills that I do think take some time to cultivate. And I do think, again, like I was talking about in the beginning, there is a difference between just getting the research done and really having a sense of what kinds of information you're looking for, how then to take that information and turn it into insights. I mean, I think I'm naturally good at that, but I also think I've had a lot of practice. I know when something is an aha moment, and I know what kinds of things will move the dial forward or the product forward or thinking forward. I know when something's going to be an idea that everyone will go, well, absolutely not, or when something will easily be accepted. So I think it's those kinds of nuances that I think are very difficult to learn from a boot camp, for instance. I know a lot of people go to boot camps and they're like, oh, in 6 months I'll get that user researcher job. And I think maybe they can, but they have a harder time with all of the other aspects that they didn't learn in the bootcamp, which are all these things that I'm talking about. So
Right.
I do just want to kind of dispel, I guess, the fact that user research is easy. And yeah, one
Yeah.
more
Mm-hmm.
that I'll
Go
just
ahead,
throw out.
please.
I'm just looking at the time. But I think another one, I hear a lot about human-centered design, and I really do think that one of the things I love about user research is it is user-focused, and it is similar to other kinds of ethnographic work I've done. You are kind of for the person who is not in power. You're trying to help service and you're understanding them. So it's a political position, right? But I do think also within user experience research, it's a bit of a misnomer that we're always for the user, because the user doesn't write the paycheck, right? We are for the user, but you are working for a company. So there are always kind of these balances, and usually the best products are going to be most informed by users and what users need, and so it's vital to speak to users. But I don't think user research is going, oh, what do users want, and then let's just build the product around that. It's not quite that simple. So that's the other kind of piece, is you're always sort of balancing the business requirements and thinking, at least I think a good user researcher / strategist is thinking about all of those things in that role as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wow, great. I'm so excited by your answers, because the way you answer these questions are very revelatory, and very, very truthful. I can feel the charge of truth. And when you said that it's not as easy as it might look, I was reminded of, sometimes people say, I'm a great listener, but I just can't talk. But listening is difficult. People who say I'm a great listener, you sometimes might underestimate how difficult it is to listen. And you connected listening with research. So I'd like to also hear about the work you're doing now, what projects you're working on. Do you have courses that you offer online or offline? Please tell us a little bit more about both your current work and future ideas, how you envision the future path.
Yeah, so I'm still keeping one foot in academia as well, or, this is a recent move for me. So again, I told you in the beginning, I try not to kind of define my identity around a position. So I consider myself a user researcher, but I also consider myself all those other things, a scholar, artist, and activist. So I'm currently working, I'm leading a workshop at the American Society for Theater Research at the end of the week, actually. And I'm also working on a book around the dissertation I was telling you about, Palestinian experiences of occupation. And beyond that, in terms of user experience research, I like what I'm doing now, and I'm hoping to gain more experience working within this consultancy context. But my real kind of hopes and dreams, I guess, through beyond this are working to integrate more of the embodied approaches, more of the creative approaches that I used in my dissertation research, towards thinking more about, how people are working with technology as culture, working in potentially freelance capacity, and thinking about how bodies in space, are kind of co-created, and the relationship of our online world to our, as my 12-year-old son says, IRL world in real life. And those kinds of the blended sort of kind of cyborg types of realities that are kind of being created. So I really feel the creative work that I've done, has a role there. And I also thought a lot about in my scholarship, emotion. And right now in user research, a lot of the frustrations users feel are called pain points. But there's, it's not just pain, there's a kind of a range of emotions that users experience. So I would love to, further develop that. And I think the field of user experience research, one of the things I love about it is it seems to welcome innovation. So I'm really excited about, adding my own 2 cents there and seeing how I can help to kind of, grow that and revitalize it and take it in a new direction as well.
Okay, wow, great. I'd love to invite you again for another conversation once your book is published.
Oh, thank
Yeah,
you.
no,
Thank
yeah,
you.
this was.
I really appreciate the conversation too. I love, as you may tell, I love talking about research. So,
It was.
and I like that your community is also a blend of academic and non-academic. So I'm excited to speak to your audience as well. So thank you so much for
Great.
inviting me to.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a little bit fast paced because we are both doing this after hours. So, but it was a pleasure. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
And let me stop the recording and then we will say our own goodbye.